Vancouver is not for everyone. In this box, I have 20 things that I've observed over my 50 years living in Vancouver that I think you're gonna hate. I'm gonna put this box down and we're gonna go through each and every single one of these, and I'm gonna be brutally honest with you. Your job is to decide if you can live with these. Now, number one, making friends. One of the giant issues that people have with living in Vancouver is social connections. And this is something that comes up again and again and again. One of the biggest issues that people have in Vancouver is feeling lonely. And this is an issue around connecting with other people. So you need to be aware of this if you're moving to Vancouver, that you may find that it's a little more challenging socially than other places that you might have lived in or visited. I think there's a few different reasons for this. I don't want to make excuses, but I think there is a different reality of living in Vancouver, in a place where so many people come from different places. My experience of living in Vancouver is that social connections are very different in different parts of the city. And I know that in certain places like downtown Vancouver, as an example, people are exhausted with people coming and going. And so they make less of an effort sometimes to connect with other people. They're there because they want to be in the middle of nightlife. They have their own friends. They're not necessarily wanting to connect with their neighbors. Whereas there are family neighborhoods in Vancouver where people make incredibly strong connections and they put down very strong roots. And there's not a lot of turnover. And I think that is one of the distinct reasons why you see this difference. So yes, there is an issue around making friends and connecting socially in parts of Vancouver, but I think it's important to know it's not necessarily uniform. So let's move on to the second thing. Pull it out of the box. Number two, traffic can be a nightmare. That is true. Vancouver has been rated by some factors, by some ratings, as one of the hardest places to get around, where traffic commuting is really bad. And you can spend a lot of time in traffic in Vancouver. And I do think it's important to note that you also have control over this depending on where you live. If you live on one side of Metro Vancouver, which is over 3,000 square kilometers in area, and you're commuting to the other side of the city, well, traffic might be an issue. And it's specifically an issue because the Metro Vancouver region, we're very densely populated. We're surrounded by geography that constrains us. And then we're also surrounded by water, whether it's ocean, rivers, or lakes. There's bodies of water everywhere that we have to cross to get from one municipality or one neighborhood to another neighborhood. So if you're living in Surrey and you need to get into downtown Vancouver, traffic is quite bad. The reason for it is that you have to cross bridges. It is those bridges that are the most constraining factors in getting people around. My advice to a lot of people is try and get rid of those. Try not to have to cross a bridge. Try and live closer to work. And ideally, be in a place where you can take rapid transit, specifically either the West Coast Express or the SkyTrain. And that can make a world of difference. So I think those complaints about traffic are justified, but know when you're moving here that you also have an ability to control the traffic and control how much time and aggravation traffic might be for you. Number three, well, that's upside down. Winter, darkness. Yeah. So Vancouver can be a dark place in winter. There's no doubt about it. We have a winter that can feel like it lasts for a very long time, and we are in the Northern Hemisphere. So if you're moving from southern realms, you may find this is not something that's terribly welcoming. And also, if you're moving here from somewhere that gets a lot more sun in the winter months, you may not really enjoy our winters. And specifically, I'm talking about the prairie provinces. My ex-wife is from the prairies, and she used to complain about our winters a lot. And it never even occurred to me, having grown up in Vancouver, that there was really something different in the middle of winter. And I always enjoyed winters. They were kind of cozy. It's a time where I'd wrap myself in a blanket and curl up in a ball in front of the fire and read a good book. But those complaints that rightfully she pointed out, I was like, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. And so sure enough, it started to bother me a little bit as well. So yes, our winter, which generally kind of runs from roughly November until end of February, that's prime winter months. Temperatures get down to 5 degrees, perhaps as low as -5 degrees, but that's not super common. So our temperatures in winter are relatively mild. We don't get a lot of snow, which is also something that a lot of people people really enjoy. But what we get in those months is more cloud cover, more rain. You can get roughly 25 days out of the entire month that it is raining. And when it's not raining, most of the time it's also covered in cloud. So that is something, that darkness that you feel in the winter months is something that you need to be aware of. And not everybody is really gonna love or enjoy or even be able to live with. Now, number 4, we have a work-life balance. So I want to point this out because a lot of people that are coming from places that are a little more business oriented or economy oriented, that have that A-type personality, that inner drive to succeed and grow and make a lot of money, that's not something that most people in Vancouver are really driven by. Most people that come to Vancouver and want to live here are driven by a desire for a balance between work and life. You don't move here purely for economic reasons. It's expensive. You don't tend to maximize your income when you live here. And unless you're kind of self-employed or self-driven, but most people that are moving here are coming here because they're wanting that work-life balance. They want access to the outdoors. They want to be surrounded by the natural beauty. And yes, they probably need to work and they probably need to make income somehow, but they also want to really enjoy their time off and they want access to be able to do that generally in the outdoors. And I know from personal experience, from talking to people that move here, for some people, if you're moving here from specifically places like New York City or London or Toronto, it can feel like things are real slow here and that nobody is really motivated to get anything done. And that can be really frustrating for people that are moving from bigger, more driven economies when they move to Vancouver. Number five. What's that? Casual clothing. Yeah, that's basically tied into the work-life balance. Also something that drives people nuts when they come here, especially from big cities like Toronto and New York City and even LA, London, Berlin, places where things are a little more formal. Vancouver is a relaxed place. And I would say it's more similar down the West Coast, places like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, LA to a certain degree. All these cities are much more casual than our East Coast cousins, where things are a little more formal. So you can go into some of the nicest restaurants in Vancouver, some of the nicest businesses in Vancouver, and you may be shocked at what people are wearing. And they might be just wearing jeans and a t-shirt, or more often than not, there's athleisure wear involved. This is the birthplace of Lululemon after all. And so people are comfortable. And at any moment, they don't know when yoga might break out. So you got to be dressed and prepared for it, or where you might want to go on a hike or run around a seawall. I'm kind of joking about that, but people are definitely a little more casual. And I myself am that way. I know that some of my colleagues around Canada are much more formal. They will wear a suit to work every day in order to meet all of their clients. That is not something that I do. I will dress nicely, but I will not dress formally, because that is, to some degree, for most Vancouverites, it's a bit jarring when people are a little too formal. And just keep in mind, if you're moving here from somewhere else, I don't want you to be jarred by people being so casual around you. Now, I did mention that I'm a real estate agent, and I should point that out. I am a realtor that has helped over 500 people settle in and move to Vancouver, helping them find their right home. And if you're thinking of moving here, if you're thinking of buying a home, I can help you as well. My contact information is right there on the screen. Be sure to reach out whenever you are ready. I'm happy to help you, happy to have a conversation about how I can help move you and your family to the right home here in Vancouver. But let's get back to the video. And next, what do we have? We have rain. Yes, rain is a factor of life in Vancouver. There's no doubt about it. And this is one of those big stereotypes that people have about living in Vancouver. So yes, it does rain. But I think what you might be surprised about is that it doesn't rain a lot in the summer months. In fact, you can go the 3 or 4 months of summer are when we see the least amount of rain. And you can go weeks without seeing any rain. In fact, we have droughts in the summer months where we have to conserve water in an area where we're surrounded by a rainforest. So that gives you an idea of how little rain happens in those 3 to 4 months of the summer. Where the rain happens is in the winter months. And so we get a lot of rain from roughly mid-November until the end of February, beginning of March. That is where the most amount of rain happens. And as I mentioned earlier about winter, you can see pretty much about 25 days of the month where there's going to be rain. The thing about rain, though, is it's relatively light. We don't get tropical downpours. In fact, I don't own an umbrella. And most people that are true Vancouverites do not own umbrellas. It's something that somebody moving here from somewhere else will pick up because they think they need one when they live here. But the truth is, they're kind of an annoyance because really most of the time it's just kind of drizzling a little bit. And sure, your face gets a little moist and your hair might get a little wet. And perhaps if you're a female that's spent, or anyone who spent a lot of time on your hair, perhaps you're going to be a little more concerned about it. Now, obviously, at this stage of my life, I don't have a lot of hair anymore. So I'm less worried about my hair than most people probably are. So yes, there are the occasional downpours, but that is by no means what the majority of weather is like in Vancouver in the winter. It sort of just trickles down to varying degrees mostly. And so what you do need more than anything, yes, you might want some waterproof shoes or rain boots of some kind because there are going to be puddles around, especially in the middle of winter, and you are going to want a good rain jacket. But an umbrella, quite honestly, is overkill. And this is not the tropics. This is not where you're going to see massive amounts of rain happen all at once. But I also want to point out that your experience of rain will really depend on where you live in Metro Vancouver. There are all sorts of microclimates where basically you can see triple the amount of rain in one location. I'm looking at you, Lynn Valley in North Vancouver, versus another location, and I'm looking at you, Tawasin, in the southwestern corner of Metro Vancouver. That's where you're going to see the least amount of rain, just about 900 millimeters of rain annually. The city of Vancouver gets about 1,200 millimeters of rain. In the grand global scale of things, that's not a ton. But keep in mind, it is mostly in the winter and very consistent. So yes, it does rain and you will experience rain no matter where you live in Metro Vancouver, but there are ways to kind of keep that under control. If you're very sensitive to it, you need to pick an area where there's less rain and more sun versus an area like Lynn Valley in North Vancouver or Port Moody or Mission where it's going to rain more. Here we go with number 7. We have challenging to make money. Yeah. It can be, absolutely. So if you look at Vancouver on a scale of income, comparing it to other Canadian cities, it's mid-tier. It is not on the higher end. And I think there are some explanations for this. We do have an outsized homeless population. If you are homeless in Canada, you'll typically want to live in a more desirable environment, a place where the weather isn't too extreme, where it's not too cold in winter and not too hot in summer. And so where is the perfect place that's the bigger metropolis? Well, it is Vancouver. So we have sort of an outsized homeless population in Vancouver. And as a result, one of the impacts of that is that our average income is driven down substantially because there is a fairly large low income population in Vancouver. The other thing to know is if you are coming here without those white collar skills, so a high education with information economy type of skills, it's going to be a bit of a struggle. And so those lower end jobs that are more manual labor, things like working at a gas station or even working sort of lower end construction, manual labor type jobs, working in warehouses, those aren't plentiful and they're not abundant in Metro Vancouver. We don't have a strong sector in that regard. And that is absolutely true. I cannot argue that point. But what we do have is a very high end of employment. So people that have a lot of education, a lot of drive, and a lot of skills, they're able to make very good money in Vancouver, just as they are in other parts of the world. So if you are a lawyer, a doctor, a nurse, an engineer, an architect, someone that's highly skilled in the trades, you're going to find opportunities in Metro Vancouver similar to what you're going to find elsewhere. And even more than that, something that is very common in Metro Vancouver is to be entrepreneurial and for people to find other ways to make money in order to survive here. And so there is an entrepreneurial spirit that is similar to some other places, but I'd say above and beyond what you might see in many cities. So there's a lot of people making money in very interesting ways in Metro Vancouver, but the long and short of it is, if you're coming here, you're perhaps new to Canada, or you're trying to make it as sort of at the beginning of your job growth, this is a place that is very challenging to get that started. Here we have housing. No doubt about it. This is something that is very true about Vancouver. And I think you're going to know if you've been spending any time doing any kind of research about moving to Vancouver, that Vancouver is an expensive housing market, whether you're buying or renting. And we've just gone through a period of a few years where prices have kind of gone sideways. We had interest rates spike and now interest rates are on the decline. So to some degree, things are becoming a little more affordable. But that is, on the grand scheme of things, to most people in Vancouver, owning a home home is something that they can only dream of. To be able to afford a $2 million house to live in the city of Vancouver or a $1 million condo is beyond the means of many people, and especially if you're just starting out. And it's something that they can only dream of. This is a challenge in Metro Vancouver, and it's a reason to some degree that people that move to Vancouver, it becomes a little bit self-selecting. You understand that this is an expensive market, and so you're likely only to move here if you can afford it. And if you can't, then you're probably going to choose to move elsewhere. This isn't something that is likely to change. My entire lifetime, Vancouver has been an expensive city, but it is becoming increasingly out of whack between incomes and the cost of housing, which is something that a lot of people wonder about, whether or not there's going to be a correction. Now, my personal belief, and I've talked about this in a video that I just did recently, and I'm going to link it right up there for you, but is that we are actually just coming out of a period where we're adjusting to all sorts of government intervention and taxes and increasing mortgage expenses. And our market is just starting. I'm seeing the glimmer of an adjustment to where this is picking up and where the demand is picking up. So can't make any promises. My crystal ball is always very foggy, but it does appear to me that we are on the verge of seeing our market actually increase in value, something that it hasn't really done in the last few years. And in terms of renting, it is also an expensive market to rent, because if you are a landlord, if you want to invest in the market and rent a property out, well, you need to be able to cover the expenses that you have. And so typically, as things get more expensive to own, usually rents sort of follow suit. And that is the case in Vancouver. It has been about a year ago is where we saw a peak in rental expenses. And so you were looking at about $3,000 a month in order to rent a one bedroom in the city of Vancouver. In these days, we've seen roughly a 10% decline, maybe 15% decline in rents, where you might be able to find something closer to $2,700, somewhere in that range for a one bedroom. Now, keep in mind, whether you're buying or renting, there are ways to make things more affordable. And one thing, I've only talked about the cost of owning and renting in the city of Vancouver. If you move outside of the city of Vancouver, and the city of Vancouver is just one very small part of Metro Vancouver, I talk about that a lot, you want to move out further into the suburbs. And so an area like Surrey, as an example, you might see rents 30-40% cheaper than in the city of Vancouver. And if you move out even further to an area like Maple Ridge or Mission, it might be as much as 50% or more. A house in Mission at the moment, the average house is about $1 million, and the average house in the city of Vancouver is about $2.5 million. If you want to find housing that's more affordable, there are options in Metro Vancouver, but still, it's an expensive place, no matter whether you're living in the city of Vancouver or you're living in the outskirts. And that's something that you need to wrap your head around if you're thinking of moving to Vancouver. Watch your bike. This kind of ties into crime in the city, and I believe that crime in Vancouver isn't incredibly bad. And it does depend on where you move from. It does depend on what you're used to. If you come from a small town or perhaps Finland, you might find crime in Vancouver to be kind of intense. There is a fair amount of crime, there's no doubt about it. And in a global sense, Vancouver is an incredibly safe place. All of Canada is. On a national scene, Vancouver ranks amongst the higher end of crime. However, the crime that we have tends to be nonviolent. And so this is a place where I personally, I'm 6'3" and 210 pounds. I can walk in some of what is considered the worst neighborhoods in all of Canada, and I feel pretty comfortable. I'm going to pay attention to my surroundings. I'm not going to be careless. I'm not going to be stupid. But it is an area that I feel comfortable being in, and I actually frequent a fair amount. I spend a decent amount of my time doing some work on the downtown east side, and it's a community that I'm somewhat familiar with. I don't want to pretend I've never lived there, but what I see is that it's a very tightly knit community where the people all know and care for one another, and they also recognize outsiders. So on the whole, you're going to be left alone, and it's a safe place, even in what is considered the most dangerous part of Metro Vancouver. The reality, though, is that there is a fair amount of petty crime in almost every part of Metro Vancouver. Now, the hotbed of it is the downtown east side, and as you move away from that, as it sort of radiates, the proximity does matter. The closer you are to the downtown east side, the more likely stuff is going to disappear. I wouldn't personally be riding my mountain bike downtown and locking it up outside of a bank and going inside, because it quite potentially could be taken as soon as I come out. I would also not leave things visible in a car anywhere in Vancouver. If I'm going to the mall, I take a look around my car and make sure that anything valuable just isn't visible. If I go downtown, it's the same thing. And even here where I live in a single family residential neighborhood, I'm also conscious of that. My car has never been broken into here. My windows haven't been smashed. But what has happened is a couple times I've left my doors unlocked and I've left things in my car. And then a couple times in the 12 years that I've lived here, my car has been rifled through. And so for the most part, you can live in the city and not really be worried about that type of thing, and certainly not be worried about violent crime. It can happen. And it does happen, and I don't want to pretend that it doesn't. Yeah, in recent years, there have been media reports, and it kind of gets blown up about random attacks here and there, and that sort of thing does happen, unfortunately. But to be perfectly frank, it's not something that I worry about. It's not something that I worry is going to impact my children. I am more than happy for my kids to be able to one day, as they get a little bit older, walk to school on their own, to go out with friends. When my wife and I go out and we spend time downtown or in quote unquote rough neighborhoods, we're not particularly concerned about our safety or about whether our car is going to be there or not. It's really this petty crime. Watch your bike. And here we have bears. So this is something that can blow people's minds when they're moving here from somewhere else. I mean, the city of Vancouver is 3,000 square kilometers. It's got over 3 million people. It's incredibly urban, but we are on the edge of wilderness, and you need to be aware of that. There are parts of Metro Vancouver where you have to be concerned about what you leave outside because of the wildlife. I mean, there are coyotes that live in my neighborhood. There are raccoons. There are crows, of course, and seagulls that we might see. Bald eagles are around. They do pretty well in the city. But I think what is going to shock a lot of people is the bear situation. And specifically, this happens more often than not on the North Shore. This is where you're going to want to be aware of it, whether you're living, let's say Burke Mountain in Coquitlam or Heritage Woods in Port Moody or up North Vancouver or West Vancouver. These are areas where you have to be worried about what you put in your garbage because a bear could be rifling through that. And there are bears that wander out of the mountains and come down because they're hungry and they're trying to find some food. I'd probably be a little more scared of walking up in the mountains on my own, sort of through a drought or something like that, than I would walking in the downtown east side, because bears don't mess around. And I've encountered a number of them in my life. I enjoy being in the woods. I mean, frankly, it's not something that there are precautions you take. And so locals don't typically worry about that. We know how to handle ourselves around bears and make sure that we don't get into the wrong situation. But I know, as an example, I had a friend of mine who is from Australia, and he's an outdoorsman in Australia. Incidentally, a place where, is it just me, or like everything in Australia can kill you? They had a prime minister that disappeared one day. He just went for a swim and didn't come back. They think a shark ate him. Now, he is afraid of going in the woods in Vancouver. I had to laugh when he said that, because I literally said what I just said to you about Australia. Australia terrifies me. The outdoors in Australia. The outdoors in BC is quite manageable. The only thing you really need to worry about is a hungry grizzly bear, and especially if you get between it and its cub and you surprise them. That's where you're going to get into trouble. So don't do that. Just make noise. Next, what do we have? Cyclists everywhere. So this is a bone of contention that comes up for Vancouverites over the last dozen years. I think to some degree we've kind of moved past it, but about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we started creating more and more biking lanes, cycling lanes in Vancouver. And everybody was like, what, is anybody going to use these? Nobody bikes to work. Come on, we live in Canada. The winters are cold. It rains a lot. And true enough, there's a certain degree of fair weatheredness to cycling. But to be honest, we have in the city of Vancouver specifically a lot of cycling lanes, a lot of measures to protect cyclists on roads, and they're becoming more and more adopted. So it's a bit of if you build it, they will come. And in particular, in the summer months, there's a lot of people who, whether they're just cycling to work or to school or just going to see friends and doing typical sort of errands on their bikes. In some neighborhoods, it's almost more common to be on your bike than it is to be in a car. And I'd say the West End is one of those examples. So when you're driving around, you really have to be careful, kind of have your head on a swivel valuable because there are cyclists around a lot. Not all of them typically have a lot of experience, and especially the ones that are using, there's a bike share program now. There's even a scooter share, speaking of using alternate types of transportation. As a driver, you really do need to be aware of where cyclists are at all times. And to a certain degree, Vancouver is one of those cities where probably cyclists get a little more priority. And it really does depend on where you are in Metro Vancouver. This is pretty specific to the city of Vancouver itself. And I would say very much so in certain neighborhoods of Vancouver. And I would say like Mount Pleasant would be one, Commercial Drive would be another, the West End would be another. These are all more densely populated neighborhoods where people are probably going to choose alternatives to driving a car more often, and where everything is a little more close together, where cycling is sort of a better option. Cyclists are absolutely everywhere. If you love to bike, this is a city for you, and you don't mind hills. Here we have, what do we have? Everyone has more money than you. Yeah. Sometimes it feels that way in Vancouver. I gotta say, Vancouver, as I spoke about earlier, about economic opportunities, according to the stats, people don't make as much money in Vancouver as they do elsewhere. But man, do people seem to have a lot of money. You know, whether it's driving very expensive sports cars or electric vehicles, wearing expensive clothing, as we said, usually it's casual clothing, wearing expensive watches, going on lots of trips, having multiple homes, spending time in different countries. There is a lot of money, and spending a lot of money going out and on drinks and on expensive restaurants. If you want to spend a lot of money, Vancouver is a great place to do that. There's a lot of opportunities to spend a lot of money. There's people who have a lot more money and they are flashing it around to a certain degree. I think part of the reason for this is there's a lot of, Vancouver has become, and most cities have become, more international in scope. And so there are people who make money elsewhere and they've brought it to Vancouver. And I think a lot of the comments are going to say, yeah, these are our foreigners that live in Vancouver and are bumping up our real estate prices. To be honest, it's actually Canadians. What I see most of the time is that it's either permanent residents or people that have become Canadian citizens that still have a leg or a foot in the door in a different country, whether that is in Russia or Germany or England or the United States or in Asia, in China or Japan. People tend to be, if they've started making money in those places, they typically keep that going while they still want to move here and live here, and they move their family here. And so you are going to see a lot of wealth. And the one thing I didn't talk about actually in all the examples of wealth in Vancouver is owning real estate, right? And these days, even just owning your own home is a significant indicator of wealth, because this is, as we've said, an expensive market. So even just being able to not afford a single family home, but even just being able to afford a condo is an indication that you have more money than the vast majority of people in this world. AC is almost non-existent. That is true. Air conditioning is not really a thing in Vancouver. And I've been doing this. I've been a real estate agent for almost 20 years. I think this year is my 19th year. Early in my career, it was something that almost nobody asked about. And then more and more, I started dealing with people that were moving here from other places, and specifically, let's say from East Coast, Toronto or Montreal. Those people would be the only ones that would typically ask about air conditioning. But people from almost everywhere else never really thought about air conditioning. And for the most part, old homes in Vancouver, not only don't they have air conditioning, but they're barely insulated, if not at all. I renovated my own house about 30 years ago, I think it was, with my own hands, pulling apart the lath and plaster walls. In behind it, well, you know what they stuffed? It was newspaper. Newspaper was the insulation that was in there. There was absolutely no real insulation in an old Vancouver house. That started to change. Maybe it was really in the 70s where we became a little more concerned about that and moved from single pane windows to double pane windows. And it's really sort of in the last 10 years or so where air conditioning has become a bigger thing. So we have typically air conditioning in office buildings, and you'll find if an office building has been converted to a residential building, that might be a situation where an older building has air conditioning. You will also find it in luxury buildings that are a little bit older. They will more likely have air conditioning. And then buildings that have been built in the last 5, 7, 8 years in that kind of range, we're going to have cooling systems. So what they generally will have is a heat pump. They actually don't have air conditioning. And so if it's 30 degrees outside, you won't be able to get it down as you could with air conditioning to like 0 degrees if you really wanted to suffer. But you can even out the temperature. So you might be able to get it down to 18, 20 20 degrees on a really hot summer's day. That is what we're seeing more and more in new construction, whether it is a condo, a house, a duplex, townhouse. More often than not, the newer construction will have a cooling system, not necessarily AC. Many people are putting AC units into their houses. As you know, in the last few years, this is becoming a bigger issue for people because things are getting a little hotter. We've had longer stretches in the summer months that are hotter. And traditionally, growing up, what I remember is we had maybe a week of hotter temperatures a year where it would maybe get around 30 degrees. In the last couple years, we're definitely getting more in the range of over 30, maybe 35 degrees. And if you live out in the Fraser Valley, further out into areas like Surrey and Langley, Abbotsford, those are areas that get a lot hotter in the summer months. So when I say, when I'm talking about this, to some degree, I am thinking about the areas that are closer to the water where the denser population is, and the ocean moderates the temperature. But now we're starting to see temperatures get 35 and over for roughly 2 weeks of the year, if not a little more. I think last summer it wasn't quite so bad, but the few summers before that, it got pretty intense. So more and more people are thinking about getting air conditioning, and they will get air conditioning in single family houses if they don't have an air pump. And here we have tipping culture. Tipping in Vancouver, a little bit out of control in my view. I mean, I remember I've never worked in a restaurant, and I think people who work in restaurants at some point in their lives obviously feel usually different about tipping. But in talking to people around Vancouver, a lot of people sort of feel like it's gotten a little bit out of hand. We live in a place where we do typically tip. People who work in the service industry often make minimum wage or very little above that. And in restaurants in particular, we have seen, with the little handheld devices, sort of minimum tips started around 10%, 12%, 15%. You'd always have those three options. They've moved up really since COVID, where I've seen some at the higher end, 30 or 35%. And at the lower end, maybe it's 15, but sometimes 20%. And then you also see that sort of slip into other areas. Like it's not just a restaurant where you're going to find that, but you might find it at a liquor store or at a fast food restaurant or at a gas station or, all these types of places where you wouldn't necessarily expect to be tipping. And I think what they're finding is Vancouverites are nice people, and we feel guilty. We sort of feel a social pressure. If it comes on, I know I do. If it comes up on the screen, I'm like, oh, I guess I should tip. I have to tip something. And so I think a lot of people are feeling like it's moved into a few too many crevices it probably shouldn't have, and to an extent it probably shouldn't have. But be aware, especially if you're moving here from a place like Europe where tipping isn't as big of a thing. I know my family coming from Germany, tipping isn't really a typical thing. And frankly, the service reflects that. Like German customer service isn't great. If you're in a restaurant, you're lucky if they smile at you or actually bring you the right food. That being said, just be aware. Tipping is a thing, and there can be high expectations around tipping. And here we have accessible drugs. Oops, I ripped that one. I was so angry about that one. Yes, there are drugs that are readily at hand in Vancouver, and to the point where, we were at the forefront of introducing legal injection sites for areas in the downtown east side. This was an attempt to sort of get it under control as higher levels of government were finding that things were getting too out of hand in the downtown east side, and especially it was trying to help people be safer was the idea. So at the forefront of that idea, we were also at the forefront of not jailing people for carrying cannabis. So basically you could just be prosecuted for having enough to sell. And then we went to the extent of having sort of under the radar cannabis stores that popped up all over the place. The government got involved in that and legalized those stores. So now we have legal pot stores all around Metro Vancouver and all around British Columbia. And then we went to psilocybin mushrooms. And now you're sort of seeing that in the early stages, similar to what we saw with the stores that sold pot around Metro Vancouver. We're seeing that with mushrooms as well. And it went so far that there was somebody who started a store in downtown Vancouver that was selling all drugs. And I'm talking about like crack cocaine, and I'm talking about Molly and all sorts of meth and all sorts of stuff like that. He opened a storefront and had a menu. It didn't last very long, frankly, but it does make you wonder, like, where are we going? Is that the future? And that's what that person, that individual that opened that store was trying to test. He's trying to test that the legal system, if they would shut him down, if the courts would legalize it, or tell him to stop. And ultimately at this point, that apparently is still crossing the line. But Vancouver is a city where we have a relatively liberal view of drugs. They are relatively easily accessible. As I said in another section, perhaps this has a little bit to do with that live-work balance and people looking for alternatives. We're a pretty open-minded society. If that isn't something that you're looking for, if that's something that concerns you, you may want to double think about moving to an area like Metro Vancouver. And here, what do we have? We have daycare is almost impossible. Getting into daycare is like winning the lottery, and I can attest to it. I've had to do it 4 different times. I have 4 children, and I can't believe it. It's like getting struck by lightning. We won the lottery 4 times in a row. There was a time that daycares weren't even subsidized in any way. They have become subsidized, and there are more and more an increasing number of $10 a day daycare spots, which is making daycare much more accessible. But what that's also doing is making it much more competitive to get the limited daycare spots that are already out there. So I know most other places people say, yeah, I understand. It's the same here. I don't think you do understand. It truly is very difficult to get into a daycare in Metro Vancouver. And if you're thinking of moving here, I highly suggest starting to apply to daycares before you even arrive and just taking a spot, no matter whether it's convenient to you, even if it's out of your way. There's a lot of families that I know, friends of friends, who are taking long commutes just so that they can go back to work. So they might have a daycare in New West. They live, I don't know, let's say in Burnaby, but they work in downtown Vancouver. So they have to go east first and then west in order to get downtown. And they're doing that. It's not ideal, but it's a stopgap measure. And if you are moving here from somewhere else, this is one of the things that is going to be most challenging. Aside from being able to afford a home, the second most challenging thing, if you have young children, is finding a daycare spot. And what do we have? Mild summers. It's true. I talked about air conditioning earlier. Part of the reason that we don't have a lot of air conditioning is because the summer months are relatively mild. And if you're somebody that loves hot weather, this might not be the right spot for you. So much of the rest of Canada has very hot summers. And you have areas like Edmonton and Regina and Saskatoon and Toronto. These are all places where summer months are really hot. And Toronto, as an example, is really humid. Vancouver, our weather year round is relatively mild. And I talked about that a little bit when we talked about the winter weather. Winters don't get terribly cold. To the same extent, summers don't get terribly hot. And so if you want extremes, Vancouver might not be the right place. To be honest, I've lived in a few other places. And I remember when I first moved out and I was going to university in the Maritimes, one of the things that I really enjoyed about living there was actual real seasons, and a winter where snow stayed on the ground, a summer where it really got freaking hot, and then the in-betweens. A beautiful spring didn't last particularly long. I think there what I found was the spring and the fall didn't last as our spring and fall tend to. And to be frank, one of the seasons that I love most of all, I was going to say 2, but honestly, I don't really love fall. I don't know about you, but fall just feels pessimistic. You know what's coming. It's winter. I love spring because I absolutely love summer. I know what's coming, and spring in Vancouver is one of those magical seasons. So our summer kind of begins in the spring. It's when temperatures, you're definitely over 10 degrees and you're often bumping up close to 20 degrees, and more sun is happening and less rain and less clouds. It's a period, everything is green and lush and the birds are singing. It's a really, truly magical time. For what is coming is when Vancouver is absolutely at its best, and that's in the summer months, where Vancouver is simply a stunning place to be, especially if you love the outdoors, you want to get into the mountains, you want to go on the beaches, you want to go into the ocean. That is the time you want to truly enjoy Vancouver. And part of the reason that you can is because of those mild temperatures. Now, long time ago, I got a job offer in Houston, and I was super excited about moving to Houston because I thought this is a place where it's warm all year round, and I can be, being somebody who loves the outdoors, I can be outdoors all year round. I went there in the middle of July, and right away I noticed nobody was outside. And then very quickly I realized it's because it's too stinking hot. They have the opposite problem. It gets too hot in the summers that you might die if you go outside. In other parts of Canada, it gets too cold in the winters that you might die. So Vancouver's kind of that perfect in between where everything is, it's never too cold and it's never too hot. Culture. Culture is something I hear a lot of people complain about. And again, I think I probably should have mentioned this early, but I do think so much of this really does have to do with what you're used to and where you're coming from. So some of these things will seem like a big deal if you come from one place and very normal, or a lot better if you come from another place. And so culture is one of those items. I mean, I think we have to put it in the context. We live in North America. I think on a global scale, North America isn't necessarily seen as a hotbed of high culture, but the West Coast in particular, and sort of this corner of the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, also isn't sort of known as a hotbed in general. We have stuff that can entertain you and that you can do, and that is cultural. I mean, we have a great music scene, we have plenty of sports, but fine arts would really be something I would say that is kind of lacking. A lot of art museums, that's not something that we have a lot of. And so people that come here from somewhere like Montreal or Toronto or New York City, or definitely Berlin or London or Paris, scoff at what is here in Vancouver. But I think you really do have to put that into context, and you have to come here with reasonable expectations. Conversely, if you move here from somewhere much smaller, somewhere like, I don't know, Prince George or Kamloops or Tacoma or small Saskatoon, there's a lot more going on in Vancouver, and you might not really understand what people are complaining about when people say there's no culture in Vancouver. So this is one of those things. I really think it does depend on where you're coming from and your perspective. And here we have limited nightlife. It plays really well into what I was just talking about. Culture, very similar with nightlife. Again, I think this is dependent on your perspective, and it depends on where you come from. If you come from a small town, you're going to think the nightlife in Vancouver is insane. But if you're coming from big cities where there's a lot going on, places like Montreal, even Toronto, but New York City, LA, Chicago, London, Berlin, Paris, all these cities, and probably even a second tier of European cities, Vancouver's not the most exciting city in terms of nightlife. There is stuff to do and to have fun. There's a fantastic coffee scene, an amazing restaurant and food scene. There's great music. I would say to a certain degree, we also, I think, hit above our weight in terms of what we draw in internationally. So as acts tour around North America, quite often Vancouver is one of maybe the only or one of two only stops that they will make in all of Canada, because they know if they come to Vancouver, there's people from all over North America that will come to Vancouver to make an event of it, right? So as an example, what's her name? I was going to say Lady Gaga, but that just shows how old I am. But Taylor Swift was just in Vancouver, and she made Vancouver the last stop on her Eras tour. And there were, this is of course Taylor Swift, so it's not unique to Vancouver that people were coming here from elsewhere. But I think more so than most places, people were actually making an event out of traveling to go and see Taylor Swift. And whether it's like Bruce Springsteen or the Rolling Stones, or newer, I'm dating myself by naming groups that are actually older than I am, let alone sort of new musical acts. But whether it's musical acts or comedians or whatever, Vancouver is a place that people make a point of stopping in. But we don't have like crazy nightlife where you're going to be able to go out all night and party all night if that is your scene. I wouldn't be moving to Vancouver if that's what you're looking for. But if you're looking for a place where you can have a nice time, if you want to spend some money and enjoy a social activity with your partner, a really nice date night, or hang out with buddies, there's lots of opportunities to do that in Metro Vancouver. I got one last one. This is number 20 right here. What do we have? What do you think? What is it? I've forgotten. I forgot what I wrote. Construction. There's construction all the time, everywhere. And it's not just city construction, because that does happen. And I think that's kind of a Canadian thing where a lot of construction happens in the nicer months. So they typically won't do as much infrastructure expansion or maintenance in the winter months, in the middle of the winter. So once things once the last chance of snow ends and things start to thaw, in the spring, through the summer and into the fall, that's construction season in terms of what the cities do. And you end up getting a lot of road maintenance. The highways might be ripped up. It can be a bit of a nightmare that way. And in an area where already driving around and traffic can be annoying, it only increases that. But as you know, Vancouver is a desirable place to live. And we've seen a lot of population growth over my lifetime. I've been here 50 years and we've seen this city grow so much. We continue to develop a lot. And I remember as a kid, my dad complaining all the time about new houses being built around him. And I always used to thought, man, man, you're a grump. But now, as a old man, I feel his pain. I also find myself, I haven't voiced it to my kids yet, but I probably will. But I find myself in my head with this track. Oh man, like another house being built near me. That's so annoying, so irritating. Can I not just enjoy peace and quiet on this beautiful summer on my back deck kind of thing? But that is part of the reality of living in Vancouver. And it's not just the noise and it's not just the amount of impact that it has for your commute or getting around, but it's also potentially for your views. And I find a lot of people that I've encountered over the years get annoyed about, they thought they had a view that was going to be permanent and they would never have to worry about from their condo, but stuff ended up being built in front of them. And that's, of course, a risk when you live in a city that is constantly developing and constantly growing. So you want to be talking to a realtor that knows their stuff. A realtor like me. I've spent nearly 20 years being a realtor in Metro Vancouver. I've helped 500 families move to Vancouver, buy a home, and settle into the right spot in Metro Vancouver. And of course, if you're thinking of buying a home when you come here, my contact information is right there on the screen. I'd love to be of service. I'd love to help. And all it is, it starts with that conversation. There is never any pressure, of course. And if you are thinking you're not quite ready for that, that's absolutely fine, because I have dozens and dozens of videos that I've made just for you. So you can explore Vancouver beyond this video and decide if Metro Vancouver is the place that you want to live. And so no matter what your question is, I hope you find the answer to it in one of those dozens of videos. Be sure to subscribe to this channel because I put more videos like this out every single week, all about moving to and living in Vancouver. And so you really don't want to miss a single one. And so that this video can get out to more people, something I'd really appreciate is if you could just smash that like button so more people just like you that are thinking of moving to Vancouver will find this video. Now, before you go, I'm really hoping that I can meet you on this video over here. This is a video that I did just a couple weeks ago that I really loved. It's a little bit funny. It helps you explore and understand Vancouver. That's a video I think if you're thinking of moving here, you really want to check out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on next week's video.